From the outside, the church looked like the safest place in the town. It stood on a small hill, painted white, with tall windows that caught the morning light. Every Sunday, people walked up the path in clean clothes, carrying their worries and hopes with them. Some came early, some came late, but everyone came believing the same thing, that inside those walls was truth, comfort, and guidance. The main character had grown up around this church. From childhood, this place had been part of life, not just a building, but a routine. Sundays meant quiet mornings, polished shoes, and a calm voice reminding everyone to behave properly. The church bell was a familiar sound, one that signaled peace and order. It was the place where people prayed together, cried together, and celebrated together. As a child, the main character believed everything said from the front of the church. The words spoken there felt heavy and important, as if they came from a higher place. When adults said the church could never be wrong, that it was guided by faith and goodness, there was no reason to doubt it. Why would anyone question something that brought people together? As the years passed, the main character became more involved, sitting closer to the front, helping with small tasks, listening carefully to sermons that spoke about kindness, forgiveness, and obedience. The messages were always clear. Trust the church, trust its leaders, and never let doubt enter your heart. Doubt, they said, was dangerous. Doubt was how people lost their way. The town itself revolved around the church. Important decisions were discussed there. Conflicts were settled there. If someone needed help, they were told to go there first. If someone made a mistake, they were brought there to be corrected. The church was not just a place of worship, it was the center of power, even if no one openly called it that. At first, nothing seemed strange. Everything felt normal, familiar, and safe. But sometimes, small moments appeared that didn't fully make sense. They were easy to ignore, easy to explain away. The kind of moments people told themselves were misunderstandings. One such moment happened on an ordinary Sunday. The church was full, as usual. The main character noticed how certain people were greeted warmly, while others were barely acknowledged. Some were offered the best seats, while others stood quietly at the back. It wasn't announced or discussed. It just happened naturally, as if everyone already knew their place. At first, the main character brushed it off. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it didn't matter. After all, the sermons talked about equality and love. Surely actions would match words, even if it wasn't always perfect. But over time, these moments added up. People who donated more were praised openly. Their names were mentioned with smiles. People who struggled financially were encouraged to be patient, to endure, to have faith. Their struggles were spoken about in general terms, never with real solutions. Still, the main character didn't question it openly. The church had taught them well. Questioning felt wrong. It felt like betrayal. And no one wanted to be seen as someone who caused trouble. There was a deep respect for silence in the church. Silence was treated as wisdom. Silence was called humility. When something uncomfortable came up, silence was the answer. People learned quickly what topics were welcome and which ones were not. The main character began to notice how stories were handled. When something good happened, the church took credit. When something bad happened, it was said to be a test of faith. If someone was hurt, they were told to pray harder. If someone complained, they were reminded to be grateful. One evening after a gathering, the main character stayed behind to help clean. The hall was almost empty, the lights dim. Voices could be heard from another room. They weren't meant to be overheard, but the door wasn't fully closed. The conversation wasn't loud, but it was serious. It wasn't about faith or helping people. It was about reputation, about how certain matters should never reach the public, about how handling things quietly was better for everyone. The main character froze, standing still, heart beating faster than expected. There was nothing dramatic said, no shouting, no clear wrongdoing. Just calm voices discussing how to protect the image of the church above all else. At that moment, something shifted. It was subtle, like a crack in glass that didn't break right away. The words spoken didn't match the values preached every Sunday. The tone wasn't caring. It was careful, controlled, and strategic. Walking home that night, the main character felt uneasy. The streetlights felt colder than usual. The church bell tower stood silent behind them. They tried to push the thoughts away, telling themselves they were overthinking. Surely leaders had to discuss difficult matters. Surely there was a reason. But the feeling didn't go away. Days passed, then weeks. Life continued as normal. But the main character's eyes were more open now. Small details stood out more clearly. Who was protected? Who was ignored? Who was believed? Who was dismissed? There was one person in the community who had quietly stopped coming to church. No announcement was made. No concern was shown publicly. When someone asked about them, the answer was vague. They needed time. They lost their way. Nothing more. The main character remembered how that person used to sit near the front, how active they once were. Now, it was as if they had never existed. This bothered the main character deeply. The church spoke often about caring for lost souls, about guiding people back with love. Yet here was someone who disappeared. No one seemed interested in finding out why. When the main character asked a simple question about it, the response was sharp. Not angry, but firm. Some matters are not for everyone to discuss. The message was clear. Stop asking. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The main character lay awake, replaying moments from the past. Words that once sounded comforting now felt carefully chosen. Advice that once felt wise now felt controlling. The church had always said obedience was important. That trust meant not needing all the answers. But now the main character wondered where the line was between trust and silence. Despite these thoughts, they still went to church. Habit was strong. Community ties were strong. Leaving wasn't simple. The church wasn't just a belief system. It was family, friends, and identity. During a sermon about truth, the main character listened closely. The words were powerful, spoken with confidence. But something felt different now. The message felt incomplete, as if part of the truth was being carefully avoided. Looking around, the main character wondered how many others felt the same way, but stayed quiet. How many had questions but swallowed them. How many had been hurt and told themselves it was their fault. No one spoke up. No one ever did. The church continued to smile, to welcome newcomers, to present itself as a place of safety. From the outside, nothing was wrong. From the inside, something felt heavy. By the end of that day, the main character understood one thing clearly. Whatever was hidden inside the church was not meant to be seen, and anyone who looked too closely risked becoming invisible. This was only the beginning. The feeling that started as a small discomfort did not fade. Instead, it grew quietly, like a shadow that followed the main character everywhere. Life continued on the surface, but inside, something had changed. The church was still the same building, the same people, the same words spoken every week. Yet it no longer felt the same. The main character began to notice patterns. Things that once seemed normal now stood out clearly. Certain faces were always visible near the front. Their opinions were respected. Their mistakes were handled gently. Others remained unseen, sitting at the back, listening without being heard. There was a rhythm to it all. Praise flowed in one direction, silence in another. When someone spoke with confidence and status, their words were treated as wisdom. When someone spoke with pain or confusion, their words were treated as weakness. During gatherings, the main character watched closely. Smiles felt rehearsed. Encouraging words felt selective. It was not open cruelty, but something quieter and more damaging. A careful system where people learned quickly what was allowed and what was not. One afternoon, the main character stayed after a service, hoping to understand more. They didn't confront anyone. They didn't accuse. They simply listened. Conversations around them were polite but guarded. People spoke freely about weather, work, and celebrations. But when topics moved closer to real struggles, voices lowered or changed direction. Someone mentioned needing help. The response was quick but shallow. A short prayer, a kind nod, and then the subject was changed. No follow-up. No real concern. It was as if acknowledging pain too deeply. would disturb something fragile. The main character remembered how often the church spoke about love in action, about caring for the weak, about standing up for what was right. But now, those words felt distant from reality. Love was spoken about, but control was practiced. Another small incident happened during a weekly meeting. A member gently questioned a decision made by church leadership. The question was not rude or aggressive. It was calm and respectful. The room fell silent. The leader's response was smooth, measured, and final. The question was reframed as misunderstanding. The discussion ended immediately. After that, no one asked anything. The main character felt a tightness in their chest. It was clear now. Questions were not welcome, even when they came from a place of care. Obedience was valued more than understanding. At home, the main character replayed these moments again and again. They wondered how long this had been happening. How many people had noticed but said nothing? How many had chosen peace over truth? The church taught that unity was important, that division was dangerous, and slowly this teaching had turned into a tool. Anything that threatened the image of unity was labeled as harmful. Even if it was honest, the main character thought about the person who had stopped attending. The memory kept returning. Someone once active, now erased from conversation. When people disappeared, it was done quietly, without explanation. No one followed up. No one asked why. Silence replaced concern. Trying to understand, the main character reached out privately to a few individuals. Not directly at first, just careful questions. Have you ever felt unheard? Do you ever feel uncomfortable here? Most people avoided answering. Some smiled nervously. Some changed the topic. A few gave brief responses, then quickly moved away. Fear was present. Not loud fear, but a quiet one. The fear of being seen as difficult. The fear of losing community. The fear of standing alone. One person, however, paused. They didn't say much. Just enough to confirm what the main character already suspected. It's better to keep certain thoughts to yourself, they said softly. Not everyone is protected the same way. That sentence stayed with the main character. Protected. From what? From whom? As days passed, the main character became more aware of how reputation mattered more than reality. If something looked good from the outside, it was considered good. If it threatened the church's image, it was quietly buried. During one service, a message was shared about forgiveness. The words were powerful. The tone was emotional. People nodded along. But as the main character listened, they realized forgiveness was being used as a shortcut. A way to avoid responsibility. A way to silence pain. People were encouraged to forgive quickly, to move on, to not dwell on hurt. But healing was never discussed. Accountability was never mentioned. Forgiveness became a demand, not a choice. The main character wondered how many people had been told to forgive without being heard. How many had been asked to carry pain quietly for the sake of peace one evening. While helping prepare for an event, the main character overheard another conversation. Again, nothing dramatic. No raised voices. Just careful words. A concern about how a situation might look. A suggestion to delay action until attention faded. A reminder that the church's reputation must be protected at all costs. This time the main character did not freeze. Instead, they listened fully. They felt the weight of realization settle in. This was not accidental. This was intentional. A system designed to protect itself first. Walking home later, the main character felt torn. This place had shaped their life. It had provided comfort, friendships, and a sense of belonging. Letting go of the image they once believed in felt like losing something important. They questioned themselves. Maybe they were being unfair. Maybe they expected too much. Maybe no community was perfect. These thoughts came easily. Doubt always finds ways to excuse what feels wrong. But deep down, the discomfort remained. It grew stronger each time silence replaced truth. Each time, pain was minimized. Each time, power went unchecked. The main character started to feel isolated, even while surrounded by people. Smiles felt distant. conversations felt shallow. The sense of belonging weakened. It was lonely to see what others refused to acknowledge. One night, while scrolling through old messages and memories, the main character came across a photo from years ago. It showed the church filled with people, all smiling, all hopeful. The image felt heavy now. How many of those smiles hid unspoken stories? The main character realized that the church didn't just shape belief, it shaped behavior. It taught people what to tolerate, what to ignore, what to accept quietly, and the most troubling part was how normal it all felt. How easy it was to get used to silence. How easy it was to confuse peace with avoidance. At the next service, the main character sat quietly, listening not just to the words, but to what was missing. Certain topics were never addressed. Certain questions were never asked. Certain people were never mentioned. The message spoke about light and truth, yet shadows filled the room. Looking around, the main character wondered who else felt this tension. Who else noticed the gap between words and actions? Who else stayed because leaving felt too painful? There was a moment during the service when the leader spoke about loyalty, about standing together, about not letting outsiders or negative voices weaken the community. The words were firm but calm. The message was clear. Anyone who questioned too much was a threat. The main character felt something break inside. Not loudly, not suddenly. Just a quiet shift from confusion to understanding. This was not a place that welcomed honesty. It was a place that rewarded compliance. As the service ended and people stood to leave, laughter filled the hall. On the surface, everything looked fine. But beneath that surface, something was deeply wrong. The main character walked out slowly, feeling heavier than before. They knew now that what they were seeing was only a part of something bigger, and if they continued to look closer, there would be consequences. This was no longer just about discomfort, it was about choosing between silence and truth, and the cost of that choice was becoming clearer with every passing day. The main character did not plan to uncover anything. It happened slowly, through moments that felt accidental but no longer seemed random. Once awareness settled in, it was impossible to return to the old way of seeing things. Every visit to the church now felt like walking through a familiar place that suddenly had hidden rooms. After part 2, the main character became quieter. Not because the questions had disappeared, but because asking them openly no longer felt safe. Instead, listening became the focus, observing, remembering, connecting small details that others ignored. It started with a simple request to help, organize records for a community project. The task seemed harmless, just sorting papers, attendance lists, and notes from meetings. It was something trusted members often did. Being asked felt like recognition, a sign of trust. While working late one evening, the main character came across a folder that didn't match the rest. It wasn't labeled clearly. Inside were notes, written in careful language, avoiding direct statements. Words like handled, resolved, and no further action needed appeared again and again. There were dates. Some were recent. Some were from years ago. The main character read slowly, feeling a growing tension. These notes referred to people, real people from the community. Situations that were serious enough to require attention, yet the details were missing. Everything was vague. Everything ended the same way. No follow-up. No accountability. Just closure without explanation. The realization was unsettling. These weren't small misunderstandings. These were moments where someone had raised a concern, and the concern had been quietly buried. The main character leaned back in the chair, heart beating faster. This was the side of the church no one talked about. Not openly. Not honestly. Closing the folder felt wrong, but continuing to read felt dangerous. There was a sense of crossing an invisible line. Still, the main character knew this was important. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was responsibility over the next few days. The main character couldn't stop thinking about the people mentioned in those notes. Faces came to mind. Conversations from the past suddenly made sense. The person who stopped attending, the one who seemed distant, and withdrawn. The one who moved away quietly. None of it had been accidental. The main character decided to reach out to someone who had left the church years earlier. It wasn't an easy decision. There was hesitation, fear of reopening wounds. But silence had already caused enough damage. The message sent was careful and respectful. No accusations, just honesty. I've been thinking about you. I hope you're okay. I wanted to ask if you ever felt unheard. The reply didn't come immediately. When it did, it was short at first, polite, guarded, but after a few messages, the truth began to surface. That person spoke about feeling pressured to stay quiet, about being told that raising concerns would harm the community, about being made to feel like the problem for speaking up. The main character read each message slowly, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. This wasn't an isolated experience. It was a pattern. Another conversation followed with someone else who had stepped away. Their story was different in details, but the same in outcome. They had been encouraged to forgive quickly, to let go, to not ask for explanations. When they didn't comply, distance grew. Support disappeared. The main character felt a heavy weight settle in. The church wasn't just failing people, it was shaping how they blamed themselves. Late one night, unable to sleep, the main character sat alone, thinking about faith, about what it was supposed to be, about what it had become inside those walls. Faith had been taught as trust without question, but trust without truth felt empty. The next service felt different again. The words spoken sounded polished. The message was about unity and obedience, about staying loyal. The timing felt intentional. As the main character looked around, they noticed how some people nodded without hesitation. Others looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Silence remained the strongest voice in the room. After the service, a leader approached the main character with a warm smile. The conversation was friendly on the surface. Questions were asked about commitment, about involvement, about loyalty. The tone was calm, but the message was clear. Be careful. Walking away from that conversation, the main character realized something important. The church knew how to sense discomfort. It knew how to apply pressure gently without appearing harsh. Over the following weeks, small changes occurred. Tasks the main character used to help with were reassigned. Invitations to private meetings stopped coming. Conversations became shorter. Nothing was said openly. No confrontation. Just distance. The main character understood now how the system worked. It didn't punish loudly. It isolated quietly. Despite this, the search for truth continued. The main character began writing things down. Dates, conversations, observations, not with the intention of exposing anyone yet, but to protect reality from being rewritten. Memory could fade. Words could be twisted. Writing made things real. One evening, while volunteering at a community event organized by the church, the main character noticed someone sitting alone at the back. Their posture was tense. Their eyes avoided contact. Something about them felt familiar. After some hesitation, the main character approached gently. The conversation started casually. Slowly, trust formed. And then, without being asked directly, the person shared their story. They spoke quietly, almost apologetically, about something that had happened inside the church, about seeking help and being told to remain silent, about being warned not to speak to anyone else. Tears filled their eyes, but their voice remained steady. I thought it was my fault, they said. I thought I wasn't faithful enough. The main character felt a deep ache. This was the real damage, not just the events themselves, the way people were taught to carry the blame alone. That night, the main character cried for the first time since everything began. Not loudly, just quietly, with the weight of understanding pressing down. This wasn't about personal disappointment anymore. This was about people being hurt in the name of faith. The next day, the main character returned to the folder, this time with a clearer purpose. The notes were no longer just words on paper. They were proof of a system designed to protect itself at the cost of honesty. There was fear now. Real fear, not of losing a place in the church, but of what might happen if the truth came out. The church had influence. It had authority. Speaking up could change everything. But staying silent felt worse. The main character stood at a crossroads, though it didn't feel dramatic. There was no sudden decision, just a growing certainty that silence was no longer an option. During another service, a message was shared about courage, about standing firm in faith. The irony was impossible to ignore. The main character listened, not with anger, but with clarity. Faith wasn't meant to protect institutions. It was meant to protect people. As the service ended, the main character remained seated, watching others leave. Laughter echoed. Friendly conversations filled the space. From the outside, the church still looked perfect, but the truth was now fully visible. The main character knew that uncovering this side of the church would not be easy. There would be denial. There would be consequences. There would be loss. Yet for the first time, there was also purpose. The hidden truth was no longer hidden, and once seen, it could not be unseen by now. The truth was no longer something the main character could keep locked away inside. It followed them everywhere. In quiet moments, in crowded rooms, even in prayer. The weight of knowing pressed harder each day, not because the truth was dramatic, but because it was real. And real things demanded a response. At first, the main character tried to move carefully. They didn't want conflict. They didn't want attention. All they wanted was honesty. A chance for the church to listen. A chance for things to be handled the right way, so they started small. They requested a private meeting with a church leader they once trusted deeply. The request was polite, respectful, and calm. No accusations. Just a desire to talk. The meeting was scheduled quickly. Too quickly. When the main character entered the room, the atmosphere felt different. The smiles were there, but they didn't reach the eyes. The conversation began with casual words, asking how things were going, how life was outside the church. It felt rehearsed. Then the questions shifted. The leader asked about commitment, about loyalty, about whether the main character felt fully aligned with the church's vision. The tone was soft, but the direction was clear. Finally, the main character spoke. Slowly, carefully. They mentioned concerns about how some situations had been handled, about people who felt unheard, about silence where support should have been. The response was immediate. The leader leaned back and sighed gently, as if disappointed. They explained that leadership decisions were complex, that not everything could be shared with everyone. That unity was more important than individual feelings. The main character tried again, pointing out that unity built on silence was fragile. That people were being hurt this time. The leader's voice changed. Still calm, but firmer. They warned against spreading doubt, against listening to negative influences, against misunderstanding spiritual authority. The meeting ended politely. No argument. No resolution. Walking out of that room, the main character felt something settle into place. The door to honest conversation had closed. After that meeting, changes became more noticeable. Not dramatic, but deliberate. People who once greeted the main character warmly now nodded briefly and moved on. Invitations to help with projects stopped coming. Group conversations ended when the main character joined. No one explained why. No one needed to. The message was being delivered without words. The main character began to feel watched. Not constantly, but enough to notice. Questions were met with caution. Even friendly interactions felt measured. Despite this, the main character continued to speak quietly with others, not spreading rumors, not attacking the church, just listening to stories. And the stories kept coming. More people shared similar experiences. Being dismissed, being blamed, being told to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Some spoke with anger, others with exhaustion, most with sadness. One person said something that stayed with the main character. It wasn't one big moment. It was 1,000 small ones. Each time I felt smaller. That sentence explained everything. As these conversations continued, the main character became more aware of the personal cost. Sleep became difficult. Anxiety crept in. Simple decisions felt heavy. The fear of being misunderstood grew stronger. There were moments of doubt. Moments when the main character wondered if it would be easier to stop, to step back, to return to silence. But then they would remember the faces, the voices, the quiet pain people carried. Silence was what caused this. One Sunday, during a large gathering, a message was delivered about obedience, about trusting leadership, about avoiding division. The timing felt intentional. The main character listened closely, not with anger, but with clarity. The words were framed as guidance, but they carried a warning. After the service, several people approached the main character with concern. Not support, but caution. They spoke in hushed tones. Be careful. You don't want to cause problems. Think about what you might lose. These were not threats. They were reminders. That night, the main character sat alone, reflecting on what loss meant. Losing community, losing friendships, losing identity. These were real fears, but another loss felt heavier. Losing integrity, losing the ability to look at oneself honestly. The next step was not planned. It happened naturally. The main character decided to document everything more carefully. Not out of anger, but out of responsibility. Conversations, dates, patterns, not names. Just truths. This was not about revenge. It was about protecting reality. As this documentation grew, so did the pressure. The church leadership became more distant. Opportunities disappeared completely. The main character was slowly being pushed to the edges. At the same time, few people began to stand closer, quietly, privately. They didn't speak publicly, but they expressed support. They shared their own fears. They admitted they felt the same but were not ready to speak. This support mattered. It reminded the main character that they were not alone. One evening, the main character was called into another meeting. This time, more than one leader was present. The tone was formal. They spoke about concerns regarding behavior, about questioning authority, about causing confusion. They suggested taking a break from involvement. For reflection, for spiritual growth, the suggestion was framed as care. But the intention was clear. The main character listened calmly. When asked for a response, they spoke simply. They said they believed faith should allow questions, that silence was harming people. That truth mattered. The leaders exchanged looks. The meeting ended shortly after. Walking out, the main character felt a mix of fear and relief. Fear of what would come next. Relief that they had finally spoken honestly. Over the next few days, word spread quietly. The main character was no longer trusted. Whispers replaced conversation. Assumptions replaced facts. It hurt more than expected. There were moments of loneliness that felt overwhelming. Moments when the main character questioned everything, but in those moments, messages arrived from people who had been helped just by being heard. One message said, "I thought I was crazy until you listened." Now that was enough. The cost of speaking up was becoming clear. Reputation was being reshaped without the main character's consent. But something else was happening too. The truth was starting to move. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. People were talking, asking questions, connecting dots. The church still stood strong. Services continued. Smiles remained. But cracks had formed beneath the surface. The main character understood now that speaking up did not mean instant change. It meant planting something that might grow later. As another Sunday approached, the main character faced a decision. Continue attending and endure the quiet pressure, or step back and risk being labeled as lost. There was no easy answer. Standing at the edge of this decision, the main character realized something important. Courage wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to lie to yourself. Whatever came next would change. Everything. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. After the quiet tension of the last few weeks, something unexpected began to happen. The main character was no longer alone in noticing the cracks. The silence that once protected the system started to weaken. not because someone shouted, but because people slowly stopped pretending. It began with small conversations, short messages sent late at night, quick talks in parking areas, careful words spoken with eyes scanning the room first. People did not want attention. They wanted understanding. One person reached out after weeks of hesitation. They spoke about an experience from years ago, something they had never told anyone openly. They had gone to the church looking for help, believing they would be protected. Instead, they were told to remain quiet and patient. Their pain was treated like an inconvenience. Another person shared a story about being blamed for something they did not cause. They were advised to forgive and move on without ever being heard. When they asked for support, they were told that questioning leadership showed a lack of faith. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same. The main character listened carefully, not interrupting, not judging, just listening. For many of these people, this was the first time anyone had truly listened to them. That alone brought tears, one person said. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to lose my community, another said. I thought I was the only one. These words revealed how deeply isolation had been used as a tool. The main character felt both honored and burdened. Honored because people trusted them. Burdened because each story carried weight. This was no longer about one person standing up. It was about many voices that had been silenced for too long. Slowly, connections formed between these individuals. Not formally. No meetings. Just awareness. People realized they were not alone. That realization itself was powerful. At the same time, the pressure from the church increased. The main character was now clearly on the outside. Invitations stopped completely. Friendly greetings disappeared. Some people avoided eye contact altogether. Yet something had shifted. The isolation no longer felt as heavy because it was shared. One evening, the main character sat with a small group who had all experienced similar treatment. The atmosphere was quiet but intense. No anger. Just honesty. They spoke about how the church had shaped their understanding of themselves. How they were taught to doubt their feelings. How guilt was used to control behavior. How loyalty was valued more than truth. One person admitted they had stayed silent for years, out of fear. Another said they left quietly and never looked back, but the pain followed them anyway. Another confessed they still believed in faith, but could not return to that. Environment. The main character realized something important in that moment. The damage was not always visible. It lived inside people, shaping how they trusted, how they spoke, how they valued themselves. This was the side of the church no one talked about. The main character encouraged no one to confront anyone. There was no plan to expose, accuse, or attack. The focus was on healing and truth, not revenge. Still, the existence of these conversations could not stay hidden forever. Whispers began to move through the community. Not dramatic rumors, but quiet questions. Why did so many people leave? Why do the same names keep coming up? Why are certain topics never addressed? Leadership responded by tightening control. Messages during services focused more heavily on obedience and unity. Warnings about outside influence and negative voices became more frequent. The main character noticed how fear was now openly used to maintain order, not through threats, but through guilt. Through reminders of what people could lose, some people pulled back out of fear. Others leaned in closer. One day, the main character received a message from someone still deeply involved in the church. The message was cautious, but sincere. I see what's happening, it said. I'm scared, but I believe you. That message mattered more than the main character expected. The weight of responsibility grew heavier. The main character understood now that staying silent would mean allowing the cycle to continue. But speaking publicly would bring consequences, not just for them, but for others too. There were nights filled with doubt. Nights when the main character wondered if they were strong enough for what lay ahead. Fear was real. Losing community hurt. Being misunderstood hurt, but there was also clarity. The stories could no longer be unseen. The harm could no longer be dismissed as misunderstandings. One person said something that stayed with the main character. I don't need the church to fall. they said. "I just need the truth to stop being hidden." That became the heart of everything. As more people shared their experiences, a timeline formed. Events connected. Patterns became undeniable. This wasn't about individual mistakes. It was about a system that valued image over people. The main character felt anger at times, but it never stayed long. Sadness replaced it. Sadness for lost trust, lost innocence, lost faith in something that once felt safe. One afternoon, while walking past the church building, the main character stopped and looked at it for a long time. From the outside, it still looked peaceful, clean, welcoming. Anyone passing by would assume. Nothing was wrong. That realization was painful. The building had not changed. The people inside had not changed. What had changed was awareness. The main character understood that exposure did not always mean public confrontation. Sometimes it meant refusing to play along, refusing to lie, refusing to stay silent. People were watching now, listening, thinking. Some chose to leave quietly. Some chose to stay and push gently from inside. Some remained afraid. All choices carried weight. The main character felt the pressure building toward a breaking point. It was only a matter of time before something had to give. One evening, a decision formed, not suddenly but clearly. The truth could not remain hidden forever. It deserved light, even if that light caused discomfort. The main character did not know exactly how or when things would change. But one thing was certain. This was no longer just one story. It was many stories finally finding space to breathe. And once people find their voice, silence loses its power. By this point, the main character felt like they were standing in the middle of a quiet storm. Everything looked calm on the surface, but underneath, tension was building fast. The conversations, the shared stories, the silent support, it all pointed toward one unavoidable truth. Something was going to change soon. The question was not if, but how. The main character noticed how carefully the church now moved. Messages were more controlled. Leaders spoke with extra confidence. Reassurances were repeated often, as if repetition itself could erase doubt. Words like peace, order, and loyalty were used more than ever. But those words no longer had the same power. People had started to notice the difference between calm and control. The main character did not make a public announcement. They did not post anything. They did not accuse anyone openly. Yet their presence alone had become unsettling. Silence was no longer working the way it used to. One afternoon, someone who still attended regularly reached out. Their message was short but heavy. "They are talking about you," it said. "They think you are influencing others." The main character felt a familiar tightening in the chest. Fear mixed with a strange sense of clarity. This was expected. Truth always made people uncomfortable, especially those who benefited from silence. Soon after, another message arrived. This one came from someone who had stayed quiet for years. They said they were finally ready to speak, but only if they were not alone. The main character assured them they would not be. That promise mattered more than anything else. The pressure increased quietly, not through direct threats, but through suggestions. Advice, warnings wrapped in concern. "This path will hurt you. You don't want to destroy your future. Think carefully before going further." The main character listened politely, but did not step back. At night, sleep became harder. Thoughts raced. Questions returned. Was this worth it? Was the pain justified? Was there another way? But every time doubt grew too strong, another story came in. Another reminder of why silence was no longer acceptable. One evening, the main character met with a small group who had been affected deeply. There was no anger in the room, just exhaustion. People were tired of carrying pain alone. They talked about what they wanted, not punishment, not revenge, not attention. They wanted honesty. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted to know they were not crazy for feeling hurt. The main character realized then, the goal was not to bring the church down. The goal was to bring the truth up. That distinction mattered. As days passed, leaders became more direct. The main character was asked to meet again. This time, The tone was not friendly. It was serious. Formal, the meeting felt heavy from the start. Words were chosen carefully. Concerns were raised about influence, behavior, and direction. The main character was told that continuing this path could lead to serious consequences. The word consequences lingered in the air. The main character responded calmly. They said they were not attacking the church. They were listening to people who had been ignored. They were asking for honesty, not conflict. The response was silence. Then came a clear request. Step back. Stop talking to others. Let leadership handle things internally. The main character understood what was being asked. Not peace-obedience, they said no. That moment felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. After that meeting, everything changed faster. The main character was officially distanced. Public involvement ended. Their presence was no longer welcome in certain spaces. It hurt more than expected. Walking past familiar places now felt strange. People who once laughed together now avoided eye contact. Some looked sympathetic but said nothing. Others looked relieved the problem was being handled. Isolation returned, but this time it felt different. It was no longer empty. It was full of purpose. Support continued to grow quietly. More people stepped forward. Some shared stories they had never spoken out loud. Others said they were leaving the church for the first time. The main character felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever. Every decision mattered now. Every word could affect someone else's courage. One person said, even if nothing changes. Knowing someone believed me changed everything. That sentence stayed with the main character. The church continued its routines. Services went on. Smiles remained. From the outside, everything still looked perfect. But inside, trust was breaking. The main character knew the story was approaching a turning point. Either the truth would be faced, or it would be buried deeper than ever. There was fear. Real fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of losing relationships forever. Fear of what life would look like on the other side of this. But there was also something stronger. Peace. Not the kind of peace taught through silence, but the kind that comes from alignment. From knowing your actions match your values. The main character no longer asked if this was the right path. They knew it was. Whatever happened next, the truth had already begun to move. And once truth begins to move, it cannot be controlled. This was the moment before everything changed. The shift happened quietly, but everyone felt it. What had once been whispered now moved into the open, not through noise, but through awareness. People began connecting stories on their own. Questions that had been buried for years finally reached the surface. The main character did not make speeches or public posts. The truth spread through conversations. One person spoke to another, then another. Slowly, the shape of the problem became clear. Some people defended the church strongly. They said every place had flaws and that unity mattered more than discomfort. Others listened carefully for the first time. They noticed how many people shared the same pain, the same silence, the same fear. Leaders responded by asking for patience and trust. They promised things would be reviewed internally. But for many, those words came too late. Trust had already been damaged. A few people chose to leave openly. Others stayed but demanded honesty. The community was no longer moving in one direction. It was divided not by anger, but by truth. The main character watched this unfold with mixed emotions. There was relief that people were finally being heard. There was sadness for the relationships breaking apart. Nothing about this felt like victory. One person approached the main character after a gathering and said quietly, "Thank you for not staying silent." That moment mattered more than any apology or statement. The church still stood. Services continued. But something had changed forever. People were listening differently now, watching more closely, asking questions they once feared. The main character knew this stage was painful, but necessary. Exposure was never comfortable. It was disruptive. It challenged beliefs and routines. Yet, in the middle of the discomfort, something honest had begun. The silence was broken, and once broken, it could never fully return. Time did not fix everything, but it changed how things were seen. The noise slowly faded, leaving behind a quieter kind of truth. Some people stayed, some left. Some needed distance just to breathe again. There was no single ending that felt complete, only many small ones that unfolded over time. The main character stepped away from the church building, not with anger, but with clarity. What had once felt like home no longer felt safe, and safety mattered more than tradition. Walking away was painful. It meant letting go of familiar routines, shared memories, and people who once felt like family. But staying would have meant pretending, and pretending had already taken too much. Outside the church, healing was slow but real. Conversations felt honest. Questions were allowed. Faith became something personal again, not controlled or monitored. The main character learned that belief did not belong to any building or group. It lived in actions, in kindness, and in truth. Some people from the old community reached out quietly, not to argue, not to defend, but to understand. Others never spoke again. Both responses were accepted without resentment. The church continued, changed in some ways, unchanged in others. Institutions move slowly, but people move when they are ready. The main character never claimed to be brave. They only refused to stay silent. And that refusal gave others permission to speak, to leave, or simply to stop blaming themselves. Looking back, the story was never about exposing a place. It was about revealing a pattern where silence was praised, pain was minimized. An image was protected more than people. The lesson was simple, but not easy. Faith should never require someone to lose their voice. Truth should never be treated as a threat. And community should never come at the cost of dignity. In the end, the main character found peace not because everything was resolved, but because everything was finally honest, and sometimes honesty is the beginning of real faith.